Well, hello everyone, and thanks for watching and then calling in or writing in. What I'd like to do then is sort of take the questions that were forwarded to me. I'm going to answer them not necessarily in order that they came in, but in order of sort of chronology and what sort of makes sense for one to follow on the other. And the first question was sent in by Mary Beth Mioto. And she asked are there any opinions on the immigration and citizenship issue found in the papers of our founding fathers and early architects of the U.S. Constitution? And actually, if you look at the Constitution itself before the Bill of Rights, there's very little said about immigration except for that it would be open and that there would be open immigration to the United States. And during this time period, obviously, the vast majority of people who we would consider immigrants are coming from Great Britain and then to a lesser extent Germany and the Dutch. And then, of course, there is eventually the slave trade would develop as well. But the Founding Fathers don't have that much to say about immigration. However, Ben Franklin did have some problems with certain immigrant groups. He for some reason was afraid that the country was becoming too Germanic, and he was afraid that too many Germans would populate the country, and so on. But outside of that, I really haven't come across much with the Founding Fathers. They were much more concerned with founding the early republic. Now, as I mentioned in my lecture, in 1790 is when Congress has to grapple with who could become a citizen of the new republic, and that was restricted to free white persons, meaning that you couldn't be a slave and you couldn't be an indentured servant. Okay, so that's that first question. Let's see, the second question I have would be the two lectures focused on United States immigration policies. For perspective, what were or are other nations doing in the way of immigration policy? How have they impacted and shaped the policy of the United States and vice versa? Do other nations' policies illustrate any mistakes that the United States need to be wary of, or is it luckily avoiding making? That's a huge question and one that I can't answer all of because I don't really follow the immigration policies of a lot of other countries. I'll start by saying that despite a history of immigration restriction, we have had over the years really perhaps the freest immigration policies despite years of restrictions against certain people. Australia, for example, at one time had a whites-only immigration policy. Canada did too at times, although Canada now is pretty similar to the United States. The one issue that we never had in the U.S. that I'm aware of, unlike other countries, is that we didn't say that when it came to citizenship, we did not say that you could not become a citizen of the United States if you did not have American blood, whereas other countries such as, until recently, Germany, you could not become a German citizen unless you could prove German descent. It's very difficult for a non-Japanese person to become a citizen of Japan. So there, I think, really does separate one way in which the U.S. has approached immigration compared to others. Okay? Let's see. Number 3, where is the key lesson we should have learned from African and Asian immigration so that we can create a fair and viable Hispanic immigration policy and or process? And I'm going to couple that with a one-line question was, please comment on the possibilities in the future for a reversion to what we now consider bad. Hispanic immigration or Latino immigration in some ways has mirrored that of Asian immigration in the sense that the 1965 immigration bill sort of opened the door for more Asian immigration as well as more Latino immigration, but Latinos have been separate because depending on what year the census, or it's how they've been classified in the census as to whether they're white or non-white, has depended on their ability to become citizens. And in the 1924 immigration bill said that if you were ineligible to become a citizen, then you were ineligible to immigrate. And at that time, only blacks and whites were allowed to become citizens. Sometimes Hispanics were considered whites, and sometimes they weren't. Asians were, of course, not allowed to become citizens until, for Chinese, 1943, and then all racial restrictions to citizenship was lifted in 1952. Now, the possibility in the future for a reversion to what we now consider bad, if you consider bad taking race into account as to who's allowed to come into the United States or to become citizens, I don't necessarily think that we're going to revert to a race-based immigration policy or a race-based citizenship possibility. And if we do, I would hope that there would be a movement against that sort of policy, since we've come so far in leaving race behind in terms of who can become an American and who can enter the country. Right now, I have to say, in a post-9/11 situation, our immigration, not just immigration, but simply who can come into the country on a tourist visa and so on and so forth, is really being handled on a country-by-country basis and a person-by-person basis. So that's something that hopefully in the future we'll be able to stabilize or regularize with also, and I would admit, some caveat to make quick decisions as to whether an individual should be able to enter the country or not. Let's see. That was number 3. Number 4. It's an interesting question. What do I regard as the responsibilities of existing citizens in participating in immigration reform? That I would encourage everyone to be engaged in anything that concerns people, whether it be immigration reform, healthcare reform, whatever kind of law that is open to discussion among the polity, and that would be, to express yourself, letters to the editor, contact your representatives, take to the streets, demonstrate, march if that's your bent. I would like, as someone who grew up in the anti-war movement, I think it's good to show dissent. I do think we should be civil about it, however, but I think that's your responsibility as a citizen is to make yourself heard. Okay. Let's see. Number 5. Is there any hope for immigration policy breakthrough in the current administration? I have to say that one is really hard to predict. As someone who would like to see immigration reform, but done in a humane way, I personally think the administration should wait until the economy improves before we start doing too much about immigration, and especially what to do with the close to 12 million undocumented people living in the United States. The Obama administration, including people in the Republican Party, at one time John McCain, but he has backed away from that position, but even Lindsey Graham recently talks about what some people would call a gradual pathway to citizenship for those who are undocumented. Other people refer to it as amnesty. I think that those sorts of policies, while I personally would support if it's framed well, is not going to go over well with a close to 10% unemployment rate. So that, I think, we're just going to have to wait and see whether we get any real breakthrough on immigration reform. If you think healthcare reform brought out the worst in some Americans, I can guarantee you that immigration reform is going to bring out a lot of deep-seated racial fears, class anxieties, and so on and so forth. Let's see, that was 5. I'm looking for number 6. Here we go. And this one is more specific, to which I have a very short answer. That question is, did the smallpox outbreak in Hong Kong that made it to San Francisco in 1900 contribute to the politics, which I'm assuming meaning the anti-Chinese politics, or were they already firmly established by then? The smallpox outbreak in Hong Kong in 1900 really did not have a great impact on immigration policy because Chinese were already restricted from entering the United States by 1900, except for certain kinds of Chinese, meaning merchants and students for the most part. So that didn't really, it did add to the belief that Chinese were diseased. But, smallpox is something that was worldwide in 1900 as well. And finally, the last question that I received today was asking me, or first commenting, saying that Michelle Malkin wrote a book entitled In Defense of Internment, which defended Roosevelt's decision based on the knowledge he had at the time to intern U.S. citizens of Japanese descent. Have you read the book? If you were teaching a class session devoted to internment, which authors would you assign on the quote-unquote internment was reasonable side? I have not read Michelle Malkin's book cover to cover. I have skimmed it in a bookstore. She's not considered a credible scholar or a historian, so no, I would not assign her book. In fact, there's no credible scholarship that defends internment. What I do, however, is give my students access to what the government itself was saying about Japanese Americans on even before Pearl Harbor and shortly after Pearl Harbor, to show them what the government was saying about Japanese Americans at the time. I can show them hearings that were held on the West Coast as citizens were allowed to debate whether Japanese Americans should be interned, although Japanese Americans weren't allowed to attend those debates. So, that the students get a chance. I would rather do the internment was good argument through primary documents rather than later scholarship, because there are no scholars that I know of who now claim that internment was reasonable. So that's that. And that's all the questions that I have that came to me before. And so now I will take any comments or additional questions.
Hi, this is Eileen Anderson. I know that in your first lecture you touched very briefly on the phenomenon of, I don't remember if it's called return or reverse migration, and I would just be interested in hearing a little bit more about that, what factors drive that, and just a little bit about what the historical trends are. My understanding is that today there's a fair amount of migration back and forth with Latino immigrants, and I know you mentioned that at one time there was a lot of that with Italian immigrants.
Yeah. Yes, there has always been a lot of return migration, probably with the exception of Jews for obvious reasons, and as well as Irish. Once Irish left Ireland because of the potato famines, very few went back. But other groups, whether they be Italians, Chinese, Japanese, and most recently Latinos, especially Mexicans because of the proximity of Mexico, and we're only divided by a border. There is a lot of people going back and forth, and all immigrants have come to the United States for a variety of reasons. I think historically we can say that a vast majority come for economic reasons. Some may come for religious reasons, political reasons, but really most come for economic reasons. They send money back, or else many have come to make enough money to go back to their home country, to live comfortably. Wages were consistently better in the U.S. than they were either in Europe or in Asia or other parts of Latin America. So we've always had sort of return migration and people making multiple trips across the ocean. And nowadays, with air travel, people can move easier back and forth. And then there's also a certain population whose families have been split, and they've intentionally been split. The father may work most of the year in Korea, but has sent the wife and the parents to, say, Los Angeles, and they live there. They go to school in the U.S., but the father goes back and forth to Korea. And because of the use of the Internet and with Skype and things like that, families can keep in touch in ways that they certainly couldn't have in the 19th century. There is a certain portion of people who live in America who really are floating between countries, but maintain their citizenship often in their country of origin. Of course, if they have children who are born in the United States, those children are automatically American citizens. Okay?
Other questions?
Yes, this is Hugh Hawkins. As I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, my education showed immigration as, a wonderful thing. There may have been some mythology, but there's certainly a lot of truth about the beauty of our country, allowing immigrants to come in and so on. You'd think that type of education and background would carry through to the way that we deal with immigration problems, but in my experience, it hasn't. What are the ways that we can, from an educational point of view, in our systems, both in pre-college and college years, help to deal with that problem?
And are you saying that the problem is that we no longer teach immigration history in a way that values the contributions of immigrants? Well,
no, I think in a broader context we seem to have a lot of problems in general dealing with immigration, and a lot of it has to do with how people that are educated in the United States deal with people coming from other parts of the world.
No.
How can education help us to move forward and solve the problems that we deal with?
Right. Well, good question. I think what we as educators have a responsibility to, well, the way I view the world is that the United States, as wonderful as it is also simply but one country in the world, and that we all have a relationship to other countries. People come here and bring their contributions. We have gone abroad and contributed to the development of other societies. And I also think that we have to remember that almost all of us, somewhere in our past, either a recent past or a distant past, has an immigrant ancestor. And that if we can keep that in mind, then we can help other Americans to realize that we should welcome immigrants and that we should value their contribution. I think that the welcoming of immigrants in the United States goes up and down with the economic situation. I think when the economy is good, people are less anxious about immigrants. They're less anxious about people of other races than their own. When the economy is bad, immigrants are the easy targets often for those people who feel that the ills of American society can be laid at the feet of those who have most recently come.
Hi, this is Marcus in London.
Yes.
And yes, I'm wondering about the history of these things like visas, where you're an immigrant but you're not becoming a citizen, at least not immediately. Have there been restrictions on those, and has all of that all those classes of visa and green cards and everything been in place for a long time, or what's the history on that?
Excellent question. I don't know the exact date that we begin using passports. We do not have what we used to call the INS until the late 19th century, and the INS is originally formed mostly to keep Chinese immigrants out of the country. The INS has now since 9/11 been put under the CIS, the Citizenship and Immigration Service. So there's a long history of visas and documentation that begins really in the mid to late 19th century. And I don't know the history of all visas, but there's been visas given obviously for workers, there's visas given for students, there's visas given for white-collar workers, tourist visas for scientists, visas given for performers and artists and so on. But the whole institution of visas and passports is a 19th century invention that we still have passports, obviously, but visas and the terms of visas change according to political circumstances. For example, before 9/11, most tourist visas were good for 3 months. And after 9/11, now many tourist visas are only good for 1 month. What it has become a problem, however, is that even under 3 months, the INS had a very difficult time keeping track of the people on tourist visas who were supposed to only stay for 3 months. And by shortening that time to 1 month, the INS actually has more trouble keeping track of those people because they only have 1 month to try to find them. So a lot of your undocumented people or illegal aliens or illegal immigrants, depending on what term you choose to use, I've read recently that up to 40% of the illegal immigrants in our country are not people who entered the country illegally, but are actually people who entered on various visas and then faded into the American landscape and never returned home. And they would often be people on tourist visas.
Other questions? Scott, I might hop in with one, moving back into history. Were the principal objections to Chinese immigrants in the late 19th century just that there were too many to absorb, or was it job displacement for existing citizens, or was it something about their perceived character that was considered at odds with America's interests?
Yeah, I've always seen it as a combination of all of those things. The Chinese come in what I would call recognizable numbers during the gold rush of 1850s to California. They had actually come earlier. There were Chinese on the East Coast first during the colonial period because they were part of the China trade. Like so Boston, Philadelphia, New York, all of which are very active ports doing trade with China. Every once in a while, Chinese sailors would be on those ships that were coming back, and some of them would get off the ship and stay in Boston, Philadelphia, or New York. But you start seeing Chinese in larger numbers come with the gold rush in California. And in some ways, for the Chinese, other than the chance to make some money in the gold rush, they come at the worst possible time in American history because during the 1850s, we are in the middle of the debates over slavery. So you have there, when the Chinese come and then move out of gold mining, but then go into agricultural work, they build the Transcontinental Railroad and so on and so forth. They enter the country when the nation is trying to figure out what to do with slavery, and here comes another non-white group of workers into the country who will compete for white Americans for wages. They will accept wages that are lower than what white workers will take on the West Coast. They were not Christian, which many Americans found to be unacceptable. They looked differently. They dressed differently. They spoke a language that was unintelligible to most Americans. They had different eating habits. They ate with sticks. And so it became a cultural thing. There's a very famous pamphlet that was published by the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, in 1902. The title of which was Asiatic Coolieism versus American Manhood, which will survive. And they talked about eating habits, and so on and so forth. And this one section says that, you can't have a man who eats rice work with a man who eats meat, because the meat eater will eventually lower himself to become a rice eater. Now, exactly why the rice eater wouldn't become a meat eater, I don't really know. And in fact, Chinese ate meat; they just simply put it on rice. But so I think it was an economics and a racial aspect and a cultural thing. And culture and race and economics all get wrapped up in anti-immigration sentiment.
This is Hugh Hawkins again. On the other hand, over the last 40 or 50 years, we've had significant immigration of professionals.
Yes.
Especially from India, the Middle East, and some other countries, doctors and scientists and so on. Could you comment on the effect of that and how that has been assimilated? Have people run into problems with that? And also in terms of where have they impacted upon our society? I know a lot of, for example, doctors have ended up in rural areas and have made significant contributions because of the lack of doctors in our area.
Yes, that is quite true. In the last 50 years, part of the 1965 immigration bill, one of the what they call preferences of people who could immigrate were people who had skills that were in short supply in the United States at any particular given time. During the Vietnam War era, we had a shortage of doctors because many of our American-born doctors were in the military, and therefore doctors and nurses were in short supply in American hospitals. So that is when you begin to see an influx of Filipino doctors, Filipino nurses, as well as Indian doctors. You don't see many Indian nurses for some reason. That may have something to do with Indian culture. But certainly, yes, and those people, therefore, made a great contribution. Some people felt that they were taking jobs from Americans, later. But a lot of them came, and to become a doctor in the United States, they then had to pass the medical exams, to allow them to practice medicine in the United States as well. So yes, I would say that they have made a considerable contribution, although there are some people who resent their presence because they feel that perhaps they're taking spaces away from American students in med school and so on and so forth, but when actually they come already educated from their home countries. And, there are a lot of, you do need doctors in rural areas, and even places like Williamstown. There's an increasing number of Asian doctors in Williamstown and in the Pittsfield area, because a lot of doctors, who after many years of med school and their residency don't want to settle in the Berkshires to practice, but because they'd rather be at a higher paying job in the cities, or they'd rather be at a big hospital being able to do fancy surgery, with better equipment than what is offered in the North Adams Hospital or in the Pittsfield Hospital, and so on. But those of us out here in the Berkshires need doctors too. So those jobs are often filled by immigrants. Yeah.
Hi, this is Marcus in London again.
Yes,
I have a couple of questions about policy. One of them is we have this law in America that if you're born on American soil, you are an American citizen. So we have this phenomenon of these people from somewhere else coming to have a child who will then be an American citizen, and then maybe going back, and that child will remain an American citizen. I'm just wondering how major of a role that has played in immigration patterns, and if that has always been in effect, if there are any thoughts of changing it. So that's one.
Okay. Well, I'll answer the first one. The issue of what is often called birthright citizenship, that if you are born on American soil, you're automatically an American citizen. That is part of the 14th Amendment that was passed soon after the Civil War, so that if indeed you are born on American soil, you are an American citizen. There are cases, yes, that some people come to the U.S. to have babies so that it ensures them an American citizen in the family. But, you know, I think those cases, percentage-wise, are fairly small. And most people don't immigrate to another country and try to find the means to give birth and to have that child registered and all just to become a citizen of the U.S. And you know, there is. I'm not saying it never happens, but it's really not as prevalent as a lot of people or some people would like to make it out to be. And certainly, you know, women who are 8 months pregnant don't walk across the border and try to have babies. I mean, I'm sure that there are some people who have done that, but I mean, they're very small numbers comparatively.
Hi, this is Marcus again. I'm sorry I got cut off somewhere.
Okay. Did you hear my answer to your first question?
No, but I can listen to it on the recording. You don't need to repeat yourself. So the second one was about dual citizenship.
Okay.
And if I don't know how far I got before I got cut off.
Okay.
It was about if the U.S. has always accepted dual citizenship, with the one exception of that Japanese thing you mentioned in your lecture, and what dual citizenship really means and all that.
Right. I have to admit I'm not an expert on dual citizenship. To my knowledge, the U.S. has always accepted dual citizenship, but they choose which countries you can be a dual citizenship of. Okay, so the thing with the Japanese, it wasn't that they weren't allowed to become citizens, they weren't allowed to become dual citizens. Asians were simply not allowed to become citizens. Asian immigrants were not allowed to become citizens of the United States at all until after the Second World War. The immigrants, their American-born children, were automatically citizens. But I do know people now who are dual citizens of the U.S. and Canada, the U.S. and Great Britain, and various other countries. So I think we choose which countries that the government is comfortable with being a dual citizen of. And one thing I do know is that if you're a dual citizen of the United States, you cannot serve in the armed forces of another country, however. You can only serve in the armed forces of the United States. We have a number of students here at Williams who are dual citizens of Canada, Hong Kong, or China, and the U.S. And it's always an interesting conversation to ask them which passports they use when they travel, you know, and so they'll use their Hong Kong passport when they go home to Hong Kong. They'll use their U.S. passport when they come back to the U.S. It just makes the line shorter. Yeah.
Not, I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and particularly to thank Professor Wong for the over and above the call of duty work he's done in putting together the video lectures and for joining us today. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And also thank you. It was fun.